All right, everyone, I'm going to kick us off since the gardeners are getting me going in the background. So I am Sophie. I'm the community manager here at Project FoundED. We're super happy to have you all joining us. Just my little spiel on Project FoundED. So we are a community of EdTech founders. We're focused on equity in the tech industry, and we believe that tech products can do that. We also really believe that we need to find the data sources to support the best products out there. And I know that many of you founders are kind of dealing with different challenges and things, which is why we brought this particular event today here. And we're so happy to have Morgan joining us. So we've heard, funding, big pain point, no surprise to anyone in this industry. And this particular event, we have our Executive Director at FoundED, Sandro, speaking with Morgan at Tucker Capital about the entire landscape and what we're looking at post-COVID and essentially how to have hope. So with that, I'll pass it on to Sandro to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Sophie, so much. And thanks, everybody who's joined thus far. My name is Sandro. I'm the Executive Director of Project FoundED. And I'm excited to have this chat for so many reasons. Like Sophie said, we've heard from everybody in the community over the past few months that we've had the community open about the pain points in education technology. And for us, it was just a confirmation of something that we've seen be a pain point in EdTech for the last probably forever. And so we're excited to have this conversation. But as anything, as is anything in the startup world or in EdTech in particular, funding is a big topic. And there's lots of topics within that topic to talk about. Today, we're definitely going to be talking about outcomes, how you change your go-to-market strategy based on the outcomes you're looking for, what is possible in EdTech, M&A funding in particular, and how COVID has changed all of that. So we're super excited to have Morgan with us today to talk about that. Morgan, why don't you introduce yourself and then we'll get into the conversation.
Yeah, so hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. My name is Morgan Battle. I'm the Managing Director of Tucker Capital. We're a strategic advisory M&A firm. We've been around since 1982, and we've been in education exclusively for about 25 years of those 40. So this is a market that we've seen on all levels from lots of different perspectives: early childhood, K through 12, adult education, the non-traditional learner, higher ed. And so we've gotten to get a good perspective on the whole ecosystem. So excited to be here and talk about how it's changing and where the opportunities are.
Thanks, Morgan. You bring it up in a very good way, right? Where the opportunities are, and that's most often where you have to start asking yourself those questions as an entrepreneur. One, where it is that you choose to dedicate your time to solving the problems in education that you've seen, and two, what that means for the kinds of funding that you can go after. So let me start with something that I think a reality that we all have to sort of come to terms with, and I'm sure we have already for most of the entrepreneurs out there, is could you talk about the EdTech market or the EdTech funding ecosystem in terms of outcomes, right? Startup ecosystems generally, there's lots of exits available, including all the way up through IPO, M&A, et cetera. What is the most likely outcome for an EdTech startup today? How has that changed over the last year or so? And what does that mean for how entrepreneurs should approach the market?
Yeah, so I think the most likely outcome is to be acquired by one of the main publishers. I mean, I think one of the things about the market that hasn't changed, I think all of us would like it to change, is that it's dominated by a few really large players in the market. And it's content and curriculum providers that cover large swaths of the ecosystem, or large supplemental players that exist in sort of a niche area. And so if you're a early EdTech startup and you've gotten some Series A funding or venture funding, the most likely outcome is that you're going to be acquired by a big private equity backed publisher who's got the distribution links into the market that can get you into more schools, into more districts, into more teachers' hands, and can sort of take you to a different level from a valuation perspective and a growth perspective. There in some sense, there's a hope that there would be more different kinds of exits available. But I think because of the way the market is constructed and who owns what and how hard it is to get into the market, the most likely outcome is that one of the big publishers is gonna scoop you up if they think you've got good content and you're a good team that they can back.
So I was recently reading a paper written by the guys that started Wireless Generation, eventually became Amplify, 2007. And they sort of elucidated the 11 barriers to entry for EdTech companies back in 2007. It struck me that none of that has changed, and in some cases, a lot of that stuff has gotten worse. And they point out exactly what you bring up here, which is that there's big EDU, as they call it in the paper, right? There's the big publishers, sort of multi-billion-dollar companies that are controlling a lot of what gets into the market, what doesn't. In your view, has that changed over the past 15 years, and in particular over the last year or two? Do you see any movement there? It could still be true, but is it still true to the same extent?
Up until COVID, it was 100% true. And I think COVID's changed the game on that, right? I mean, the barriers to entry have dissipated in some sense, because for this sort of finite period of time, teachers were being resourceful. They were going outside of what their districts were purchasing for them, and they had to, and they had the agency in many cases to do it. So as a supplemental resource, if you're not trying to play in the core game, which is probably something we'll get into, the difference between core and supplemental, but if you're a supplemental complement to the classroom and enhancement to the teacher's ability to engage their students, then you have a better chance of breaking into the market than you would have before COVID. And I think COVID obviously changed the playing field, but things are going to retrench now that the dust is settled and kids are going to go back into the classroom, and some of the old paradigms are going to be true, that you need print and digital, not just 100% digital. So yeah, for the last 14 years, 15 years, that's 100% been the case. Not much movement there. Over the last 15 months, whatever it's been, I think there's more receptivity to new entrants breaking into the market just for need. It's just sort of based on need.
Thank you for that characterization. Let me ask you, I do want to get into the difference between core and supplemental and what that changed and how you should approach the market, but I want to stick on that topic of what will change this fall. I've heard it characterized that, district administrators generally, as they see things returning back to normal or looking like they could go back to something they recognized before COVID, they're going to run at it, except maybe with an enterprise Zoom account in their back pocket. Does that feel true from your perspective? Is that, this fall, if everybody's back in school, is back to the way it was before COVID, or what are the changes that will stick, if any?
It's not going to be a complete change. I mean, I think COVID made people think about really leveraging digitally enabled solutions. And that was the sort of the primary goal. I think fall, we're going to return back to, as I said, some balance between print and digital. So it's going to be a more hybrid solution. But the need and the focus on making sure that there are digital resources or digital enhancements to a print product that allow a teacher to engage a student and allow a teacher to engage a student who may not be there in the classroom because they've self-elected not to be. And allow teachers to take the burden off of them as having to sort of hold all the content. But we've talked about the difference between sage on the stage versus his coach mentor. That was a sort of a nice soundbite in years past, but now it really is a requirement, because just the burden of responsibility is so much higher on teachers now. So they really need a solution that just allows them to move faster, engage their students, help them prepare and lesson plan on Sunday night when they're agitated and worried about how they're going to keep these kids' attention for the next 7 days. So I think it's going to return to that sort of print and digital, but the focus on digital as not just a nice to have, but a must have. And it's going to have to be high quality digital, not just a little digital sort of video snippets on the side. It's going to have to really be about student engagement.
Let's dig in on that a little bit, right? What is the meaning of high quality digital, right? At the beginning, when we were first thinking about creating FoundED, it really came from the realization that as soon as school closure started happening, a lot of nascent, innovative EdTech companies were in jeopardy because they weren't they were maybe working on in-classroom innovation, maybe some classroom voice technologies, teacher improvement technologies, PD stuff that just didn't apply in a distance learning context. And we were seeing even then that the only thing that was going to be successful was what you just brought up, right? If you were going to have a digital product, if you were going to be, it was going to be your product and that student on their device, either at home or at school, the name of the game is engagement. Is that, given that we're going to go back to school in fall, will that still be the name of the game with high quality digital tools? Is engagement it?
I kind of want to say that it is. I think it's engagement and still sort of teacher empowered. So we can't, that's the mistake that EdTech made 10, 15 years ago. We were going to replace the teacher and scale them. Well, you can't do that because the smartest computer in the room is actually the teacher. So there's no amount of innovation or technology that's going to replace the teacher. But I think now those two things have to work hand in hand. Student agency, student creativity, student innovation, student engagement as one bucket, and empowering the teacher in another. And those two things have to work in concert. But it's going to be products that are really focused on project-based learning, bringing the real-world content into the classroom, video authoring tools, allowing students to create their own video lesson plans and architecture, and just real collaboration inside the classroom and out. So I think it's a blend of both student agency and teacher empowered.
That rings so true to me. So now I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, because I think it'll add further nuance to the things we're talking about. You mentioned that there is a difference between approaching the market as a core subject product and as a supplemental subject product. So could you characterize those markets for us a little bit, add some detail around that and how that might change the way you approach fundraising or think about outcomes?
Yeah, such different marketplaces. I mean, core is a fiefdom managed by a few really large publishers. Call it, in science, it's probably about 8. In math, a little bit larger. ELA is consistent more with math. And the cost to win in that market, and by win I mean not just get purchased by the district, but be implemented in the classroom. The teacher has to let you in, is considerable. I mean, it's a big bet that you have to make. And I think the NGSS standards that have now been created and are rolling out throughout the country, each state is its own territory, and they're in different phases of adopting the NGSS. But if you make a bet and you go after NGSS and you win, you're part of this once in a generation wave. And it's a $3 billion market that you can get access to. But you can also spend a lot of money to go into that market and lose. And you have to ramp up your sales team. The content has to be almost designed from the ground up towards NGSS. And you have to do it in some cases on a state-by-state basis. Texas is different than California, is different than Oklahoma. And some of the smaller states, you don't have to engineer at the same degree. But there is a level of handholding and investment and care that needs to go into each state. Math and ELA are their own separate animals, and those are sort of need to haves. Science is sort of a nice to have in some sense, but it's still a really big market. But it's all those sort of core subject areas are managed by a few really big players. And if you get in, you're sitting at the table with the kings and queens. If you don't, you're knocking at the door and you may never get in. The supplemental market is much more vast. It's a kind of a wide open field. The barriers to entry are much different. You can get a parent engagement tool or a teacher resource or a student resource that can be used in complement in the classroom. As you see, my son is coming back from the candy shop, and there he is. But there's just a lot of players that are out there that you have to compete with. So it's hard to really break in and get implemented.
That makes a ton of sense, and he's flaccid.
Let me see. Yeah, let me see if I can get him out of here.
It's fantastic. what I was gonna.
He's got
bring up
lots of
is-
things to say. On the next podcast, you may want to invite him to join.
Oh yeah, I'm in. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm in. It's very important to have youth-driven conversations. um, one of the, I want to throw something up unscripted here that I want to see how it fits with you. You mentioned project-based learning, right? Something that we know works. You know, there's lots of research behind it. We know that it leads to better outcomes. I would say that we're still at a point where we're not successfully been able to integrate it at scale, especially within public education. And so we see these things that we know work, that are important, that would be beneficial for education, just take a long time to get adopted. And I think the latest thing to come along has been SEL, right? SEL, I feel like, is now something that we are willing to talk about at a high level and say, yes, this is extremely important. The 74, I think, wrote today about how states are spending their COVID education relief funds. And it would be hard to find a state that doesn't have wellness or social emotional learning or some of that, at least in their top 3 of how they're spending their federal funds. Do you think that's going to change spending at all? The balance between core and supplemental? Are core curriculum providers racing to integrate SEL into their curriculum as it is? Are they acquiring other companies that might be able to help them beef that out? How do you see SEL or these sort of new areas of interest within education affecting the market?
Yeah, I think it's just a massive wave. You think about 4 years ago, sort of empowering the teachers, right? EdTech trying to sort of correct the wrongs of trying to replace the teacher. Then everyone, when we went around the market and talked to big publishers that were doing acquisitions or partnerships, it was, no, everything's going to start with the teacher. I think a lot of that was just a nice soundbite, right? It was a buzzword that was out there, but who was really standing arm in arm and shoulder to shoulder with these teachers? Truly. Some have now really put their money where their mouth is, and they're building teacher communities, and it's nice to see, but it's taken 4 or 5 years. I think 2-3 years ago, SEL was at that same point in its infancy where teachers were 4 or 5 years ago. We saw the boom happen with Committee for Children and PBS and all of these groups that were coming out with really strong social emotional learning content, recognizing that it was a core must-have in the classroom. People needed to understand empathy and treating their neighbors respectfully, and being part of communities and teams, etc. And that was probably more relevant than learning, algebra. How do you treat someone? And that's probably a better proxy for achieving on standardized tests 10, 15 years later. And groups like PBS and others had studied that, and they could prove that. I think now people are recognizing that this is the next greenfield opportunity. And whether it's for altruistic reasons, they really want to do good, or because they know that this is a big opportunity to kind of grab a hold of. I think as we've started to see what's gone on in this country with the racial and equity divides just continuing to get wider, I think this is sort of a ringing the bell moment for all of us to wake up and understand that we need to treat people the same way, and that the content in the classroom has to reflect the disconnect that's happening outside of the classroom, so people learn and we see it in a new generation of measured, responsible, empathetic learners. So I think, yes, I think it's going to be a big movement, and I think it may take a little bit more time for it to take root, but I think those that grab it quick now will be really well positioned for when this becomes a need to have in every classroom across the country.
We're seeing now, I would be remiss to not talk about the tremendous cash influx of dollars coming in from the federal level to the states, specifically earmarked for education. That is happening. One of the things that we've been thinking about lately is that is happening at the same exact time that we're seeing a constriction in the public education population. Lots of parents pulling kids out of public education generally in preference for lots of different things. In some cases, private schools, although private school enrollment is down generally. In some cases, it's for micro schools, learning, informal learning pods, or online education generally. Are these things at odds? I mean, it feels like in either case, both in the classroom, as you said already, And for these folks pulling out of public education, engagement is still king, right? But how do these two forces drive the market? I mean, how does it net out? I mean, is it just that from an investment perspective, we're still just going to invest in engaging educational content because that's the best we can do?
Yeah, I think just as you were sort of laying that out, it brings me back to how much burden is put on the teacher, because you're always going to have kids that are now going to self-select in wanting to learn from home. Hopefully that changes over time, but I think there's people for a social perspective may do better at home, and their parents may want that. So the burden is going to be on the teacher. So it goes back to resources that really are empowering the teacher. But I think, the content is going to have to be, again, super engaging outside of the classroom. And those students that are learning from home are going to have to speak to the students that are learning in school. And so, the links are going to have to be real time. Parent engagement is going to have to be a big component, because they're probably going to be, supporting the student as they're learning. Parent engagement has always been a key piece of learning. That's been studied as well. If you have a parent that's engaged, the likelihood of you learning increases significantly. But when you're going to have students that are now learning from home at a higher rate than they were before, a lot of those, there's either caregivers or there's parents that are at home, and so they're going to have to be able to be engaged. So resources that really engage the parent as well, and bring the classroom, the home into the classroom, are going to be important from a funding standpoint. So I think you'll see those three dynamics: teacher empowered, parent engagement, and student engagement continuing to thrive because of the way that things now have forever changed.
Thanks, Morgan. And I appreciate you bringing it back to the things that will make EdTech companies successful, because ultimately, I mean, I think you're totally right. These are the components that make for a successful EdTech company. My next question is really around outcomes and impact, right? Not outcomes for the company, but impact to the students that use your products. How would you say today that impact of an EdTech product correlate to investment today, and how tight is that correlation, right? I assume there's some correlation. How tight do you think it is the real question.
I don't think it's very tight at all. I mean, I think impact right now is measured by sales and whether or not you're able to break into a classroom. That is the proxy for most of whether or not you're having an impact. We talk about learning outcomes, data that supports that. That's a hard nut to crack, to really prove in an unbiased way that your product actually leads to learning proficiency and learning gain. So, this is something in 2011, we did a symposium with the Department of Education at National Geographic's original headquarters. And it was with a group called Patel, which is a large research nonprofit, Department of Ed, and us, Tucker Capital, to study this. What technology do we have in the classroom, and what data do we have to support which technologies are actually making an impact? That felt like we were at the tip of the spear in 2011. Here we are in 2021 or whatever year it is. And I don't know if we've gotten much further along than that. I think the data infrastructures are much more robust than they were, 10 years ago. But I think people are still trying to demonstrate that their product makes an impact. And if you're talking to early stage companies, everyone's going to largely say, hey, we actually move the needle for students. But who's saying it? Is it an independent research that's done it? Are you the one that paid for it? There's a lot of ways to poke holes in that. But yeah, I think impact isn't tightly wound yet.
Thank you for that. No, I would tend to agree. Let me say something out loud that I've been thinking of, and let me know how that sits with you. From, I think, our perspective over the past year, one of the things that we've seen as COVID sort of accelerates a dependence on what we're calling as hybrid and sort of engaging solutions, is that educational outcomes, equitable educational outcomes, and technology from here on out are inextricably linked, right? The teacher is always going to be empowered to deliver whatever set of engaging tools or curriculum, with it, whether it be tech or not, but the outcomes of the equitable educational outcomes of students and technology, I think are inextricably linked. There's, a certain level of it right now that I think will only increase over time. How does that sit with you?
Just trying to figure out the sort of practical implication to that in a classroom. I think equitable education outcomes is in some sense relative. Perhaps, what is equitable in Trenton is perhaps not equitable in Princeton. The educational resources and the opportunities that are offered to both school districts are vastly different, and that's part of the problem. And good teachers can be the antidote and the answer to that, but it's hard to find good teachers to work in areas where they don't have the resources, financial or otherwise, to thrive. So, equitable education outcomes, I think, is the overarching goal that we're all going for, hopefully. Unfortunately, it's not practically applied or specifically applied universally throughout our education ecosystem. It just isn't, because the funding constraints are real in certain areas versus others. Teacher quality is different in certain areas versus others. Parent engagement supports is different in certain areas versus others. And that's just a reality we all have to face. I wish it wasn't that way, but it is. So I think, resources that can actually level the playing field, 5 years from now, those are going to be the ones that you would imagine that are actually implemented, not just winning, but implemented throughout the country in a bigger way. But that's a hard road to hoe, I think.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. I think we're on that. It's a hard road to hoe. It's a road that we're happy to keep working on, though. I think from our perspective, there's nothing more important to be working on. And so I'll summarize what you've been saying since we got on the phone. To win an EdTech today in today's ecosystem, whether your outcome is being acquired, competing in the core market, or going all the way to IPO, today you have to approach the market with a hybrid solution, both print and high quality digital. High quality digital meaning engaging content that is empowering for teachers. Is that about right?
Yep, absolutely.
Cool. We've gotten a lot of questions in the chat, so why don't we go to those?
Yes, so our first question is from John from Boulder Learning, which is, what level ARR do you think is a minimum for acquisition by a major or mid-tier player of an early stage EdTech company?
Good question. It's a tricky one. I would say in the 10 to 15 million range. I think there are exceptions to that rule. If you're in the core marketplace, core, you win a big district, or you win a state adoption, you get paid all that money up front, and then that's sort of amortized over 8 years. And so your ARR is not, your recurring revenue is not super attractive, but you have the opportunity of growing throughout the entire country, state by state. And that's a very lucrative, it's a choppy sort of cash dynamic, but it's a lucrative proposition for a buyer. It's a supplemental resource. Yeah, you need to have, a decent amount of annual revenue coming in to make yourself attractive. And I think in the 10 to 15 million range is sort of the baseline of when someone's going to start looking at you for a real acquisition that's of significance.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? We've seen some go earlier, some go later, obviously. For what reasons might they go earlier? Unfortunately, the ones that we've seen go earlier are out of necessity, right? Essentially, you've hit the wall on founder-led sales. You can't quite transition to your own sales force. You've gotten to $1 or $2 million ARR, can't go much further. You don't have the energy or the contacts to go up and do a fundraise, or there's no interest in raising funds. But there's still value in what you're providing. Are there any other reasons why there might be acquisitions at earlier ARRs other than I can't do this anymore?
Yeah, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. If you got a strategic complement to a large publisher, and it's hard, or a large player in the market, private equity or otherwise, someone may look at you and think, we just came out of a strategic retreat for 4 days in Seattle, and that's the thing that we need. And they're going to overlook the cash dynamics and the revenue and the profitability and just know that if they had their hands on that, they can go to the next level. And it satisfies the strategic leg of the stool that they need. So strategy trumps these things almost every time. And so, yeah, if a founder is run out of money, is tapped out personally or professionally, it's hard, perseverance. You have to break through wall after wall after wall to get there in all likelihood. And some people, one of the things that we see is they pull the ripcord too early. And if they just stayed in another 6 months, that big opportunity may have been sitting there waiting for them. Easier said than done. As a small business in 40 years, we've had those dynamics. So, it's not for the faint of heart. But I think there are times where if you've got if you're sitting on a social emotional learning parent engagement resource that's hybrid, and someone says that's what we need, it's more of a sort of a content play than a business play. They're taking the content and the product, and they're going to pay you for the future. Perhaps, if you hold firm on your value, they'll give you credit for the value that you can create in the future. And that's a reason why someone may override that.
Great. Next question. Good ones.
Next question is from Elon. Who would be an acquirer for a company focused on education as entertainment, as opposed to K-12 or higher ed online learning?
Well, education as entertainment, that goes into the student engagement bucket. A lot of education as entertainment players are out there. PBS, Smithsonian, Discovery, National Geographic. They started as entertainment and they moved into education. So someone like that may be out there. There's some larger players in the early childhood space specifically. The names are escaping me right now, but there's some really big ones that would be looking for strategic acquisitions. Perhaps if you do a little digging, you can find out who they are. I wish I had them at the tip of my tongue right now, but we looked at this through work that we were doing with PBS. So there are specific companies of scale where education and entertainment are directly linked. But there's a lot of big precedent examples of big entertainment companies, and we've worked with most of them, that have PBS and National Geographic and Smithsonian being 3 of them, that have come into the education market. And the reason why they've been able to get traction is because they sit right at the table on the student engagement front. It's engaging for a student to learn about history from Ken Burns. So
you don't need to look far, right? I mean, Discovery themselves spent a pretty penny on Mystery Science, who was about as engaging as it comes from science content in early grades.
You bet. Good example, for sure.
Great. Next question is from Janet. Are there any other relevant insight around the
So if you're having trouble hearing you, I hear you, but you sound kind of...
Okay. Is there other relevant insight around the funding landscape for EdTech not in the K through 12 classroom? So this is independent learning orgs, continuing supplemental, career navigation, so on.
It's a tough question. Yeah, I think there's a lot of examples of higher ed reaching into K-12. Continuing education as being one example of that. There's a lot of changes in sort of the workforce readiness ecosystem that is prevalent in higher ed, project-based learning being one of them, internships being another one. There's sort of those are sort of linked, and that's finding its way into K-12. But we're seeing a lot of cross-pollination between early childhood and higher ed. You can believe that. If you're going to collaborate as a 4-year-old, you'll be a better collaborator as a high school or college graduate. And social emotional learning is actually in both of those areas. And so we're seeing groups like Northeastern and others in Southern New Hampshire University reaching down into the lower grades to find their innovation. But higher ed is a sort of a hotbed for testing new career advancement, degree pathways, supporting the non-traditional learner, bringing people from just receiving their GED or their high set into the college ecosystem and extending their educational pathways. So there's a lot of innovation happening in the higher ed space, in the workforce space, that are reaching back into K-12. Not sure if that answers the question, but that's where we see a lot of the experiments are happening in higher ed.
Yeah, and the very little color we can add to that excellent answer is that there's much more innovation, but a lot of the same problems exist in higher ed. As you know, if you operate in the spaces that doing K-12, sales cycles are still bad. It's in many ways a saturated market depending on what you're selling. It's hard to know which title you're selling to, depending on the institution, the state, et cetera. All these things are still true, but there is more innovation for, you can look at somebody like Guild Education, who has innovated in the space of, bringing employers into the question, right? Starting to take on employers as consumers of higher education products for their frontline workers. And that has impact too, has impact goals as well. So there's it feels like more movement in that sort of workforce development higher ed space than there has been in K through 12.
Yeah, and there's two things. We're seeing sort of student agency. There are institutions that are allowing K-12 students to design their college experience, which is pretty cool. Grand Valley State University is one of them, and there's a few others. And then also there's partnerships. We're working on one right now that allow adults who have on-the-job training to receive college credit at a defined set of colleges that will guarantee that they'll accept those credits. That's a novel thing to happen. We've been flirting on the margins of those kinds of efforts, but now that's something that's about to sort of take center stage.
All right, next question's had a little bit of chatter in the chat, and it is from Blackbird, and it's about, the frustration of selling to schools, and should one be selling to individuals instead as a way to get into schools? There was a recommendation of connecting with a channel partner who sells to schools in terms of scaling. Do you have any other thoughts there?
Yeah, selling to schools. I wish I had an answer on that one. That's just it's so hard to do. That's why sometimes the natural default is, instead of trying to sell on your own and build your own sales force, just align with a publisher who has the distribution reach to get in there. That's not a satisfying answer, and it certainly wouldn't be if I were, an entrepreneur. I think one way to do it is there's no better marketer of your product or ambassador of your product as teachers, and they come out of their own pocket, right? They don't just use what is being purchased by the district. They will spend their own money, hundreds of dollars a year, on their own resources that they want. And if you can build teacher engagement, teacher communities, groups like EdCamp, they do this. They'll bring teachers together, vote with your feet, sort of community sessions over an hour or two, where they'll talk about social emotional learning or dealing with behavior issues or innovative science product. And teachers will just get up and say, hey, you know what I've been using? This. And it's not necessarily the big ones, the big publishers or the big supplemental players that have PE money behind them. It's innovative resources that they found online on their own, or going to conferences or what have you. If you can build teacher communities, you can find teacher ambassadors to represent your product. There is no better marketer for your resources than teachers. It's a tribal community.
And it's research backed at this point. Last year, New Schools Venture Fund and Gallup put together a survey of who are the most influential folks in the buying decision in K through 12, and it's teachers every single time. Teacher is the number one. They're almost never the primary buyer, but they're the most influential in the process. So what we're seeing a lot of is the return of some sort of freemium products, right? Or you look at what Prodigy's been doing in terms of making the product free to teachers and schools who adopt, and then charging parents who can afford it for a at-home experience. We're seeing that model bear out in lots of places. But if you've got some way to bring a teacher in and give them enough time, I'll go back to talk about Mystery Science. It's always been my favorite example. They gave a 6-month free trial. And if you, at the end of the 6 months free trial, gave them 3 more emails of other teachers, they extended it to another 6 months to a year. So what they're essentially doing is saying to teachers, I'm going to give you the time to fully evaluate this product and build it into your everyday so that at the end of this free trial, you can't imagine going into the classroom without it. You just can't do it. And so at that point, as a teacher, you're going to go advocate for your administrator to go purchase the product for the school more widely. And so teachers are always
Teachers, 100%. It's the only power that they truly have is to say no. They don't like something, they get to say no. They're not going to use it. And so they'll find out where yes is. And if your resource is innovative enough and you're in front of them and you've got a community of connecting them, then you have a shot of breaking in sort of the back door.
And go look at TikTok. It's amazing what's happening on TikTok. Educators on TikTok telling each other about what they're using. It used to be Twitter, still is to a certain extent. It used to be lots of stuff still being shared on Pinterest in terms of lesson plans and stuff that teachers are using with each other. Facebook is always, it's a little noisier, but there's still a lot of chatter about what teachers are doing, teachers talking to other teachers about what they're doing. Breaking into those communities is going to be the best and easiest way to feed your sales process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point.
And our last question is from Mary. So she's asking about the adult education market, and I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit. But do you have any thoughts to share, Morgan, on new potential for change there due to the pandemic and economic factors, all the economic factors over the past 18 months?
What I would say about adult ed, and that is a space we spend a lot of time and we helped ACE recreate the GED with its partnership with Pearson that we put together. But it's the last greenfield market in all of education. It's the one that has not been pulled together by the large players yet. There's not been a ton of partnerships or acquisitions. A lot of funding is starting to trickle in there because people see the opportunities. I think COVID, per one of the pieces that we talked about earlier, has widened the equity and education gaps aggressively. And adult education learners who are learning how to read or trying to go back to get their GED or go to community college or go to college or four-year degree, it's harder for them. And they're a population of learners that are getting left behind. And I think as we all wake up and we have a conscience and we really try to support every student of any age, of any race, of any ethnicity, the adult education market as a function of what COVID did, I think will increase people that have a conscience and that have deep pockets that want to make a difference. And I think you're going to see publishers go into the adult education market, perhaps just for revenue generating reasons, or because they actually want to do good. And so I think you'll see investors and funders and big sort of K-12 or higher ed players that know they have a handhold for adult education learners going into the market. So I think you're going to see more funding there, without question.
Very cool. Thank you, Morgan. We're just right up against time. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and the work that you do to keep this ecosystem running the way it does. I feel that every time we talk is like we do the work that we do in these silos in education, but we're all sort of motivated by the same thing, which is that we want better and more equitable outcomes for our kids. And we believe in the power of technology to get us there. So I appreciate your time and thank you for your insight.
Well, thanks for having me. Project FoundED is doing an unbelievable and valuable resource to the education ecosystem of bringing community of like-minded people who really care about moving the needle together and having these kinds of conversations. So I was, deeply humbled to be included, and hopefully it was a good discussion for everyone that was involved.